Rise of Norman. The Fat Controller came to see Norman, Molly and Paxton. The Fat Controller spoke sternly to Norman. There still have been a bit of distrust in you, said the Fat Controller, but you will learn your lesson soon enough. But for today, said the Fat Controller, I want you to work with Paxton. You and he are going to work with Dennis today. Yes, sir, thank you, sir, said Norman. Very good then, said the Fat Controller, and the Fat Controller walked happily away. Norman was ready, and he came out of the shed. Are you coming, Paxton? said Norman. It will be like old times. But Molly soon interrupted. I want a private word with Paxton first, Norman, said Molly while she began distrusting Paxton. Sure, said Norman. I'll be back. Let me know when you finished, said Norman, and Norman puffed away. Molly spoke privately to Paxton. Why didn't you just say no, she said. Say no? Why? Said Paxton. Molly was cross. I don't want Dennis and you working with Norman, she said. That's why a trickster can share his own ways, but he is still a trickster. Look, Molly, said Paxton. Look, Molly, said Paxton. The Fat Controller has asked me to do this, he said. Well, I'm asking you to say no, said Molly. And all because I want you to say no, said Molly. Just then Norman came back. Excuse the interruption, he said. Paxton, shall we begin? Sure, said Paxton. He came out of the shed. Molly did not want to say goodbye to Norman and Paxton. Goodbye, Molly, said Paxton and Norman, and they were on their way to the yard to see Dennis again. Molly came out of the sheds. She had more work to do, and she puffed away. Meanwhile, Paxton and Norman both finally arrived at the yards. They found Dennis waiting for them. Hi, Paxton, said Dennis. I see you with Norman again, he said, like old times. Dennis, said Norman, I'm glad to see you again. Me too, said Dennis. I've heard Molly still doesn't trust you, he said. I know, said Norman. I know the other engines don't trust me, but I'll do my best. To be really useful. That's good to know, said Dennis. Let's get to work. Sure, said Paxton, and the 3 diesels were ready. The 3 diesels began enjoying themselves all day. They began enjoying their journeys in and out of the yards and working so hard at the mines and the quarries. They began to like it and felt like they were close friends again. And they began to enjoy it, and soon ignored Molly, not trusting Norman forever. When their work was over, they had a friendly chat together of what it used to be like when they were together. Well said Dennis. This was before I met Well, Paxton, said Dennis, this was before we met. This was before I told you that Norman was my brother, and this was before I met you. And this was before I met you, said Paxton, and Norman began to enjoy his friend and his brother telling stories about how they got to know each other. Meanwhile, Molly was still doing her work, but still kept thinking about Norman. She still couldn't take her mind off Norman all day, and she was very annoyed about it. On the way, she found Douglas with his coaches. Douglas was worried about Molly. Is everything okay? Asked Douglas. Not that I'm aware of, said Molly. It's Norman I can't get my mind off. Well, said Douglas, I don't trust him, but I know he'll try to be really useful like us, he said. I don't think he will be, said Molly, because, she said, I really don't like Norman, and I don't think he'll be worth my exception, just like I accepted Caitlin and Paxton, she said. This is why I don't want him with Norman and with Dennis and Paxton and Caitlin, she said. Well, said Molly, said Douglas, you're just going to have to accept it, because really, I'm worried about your anger right now. I understand what you mean, said Molly, but for now, I want to carry on with my work right now. As you wish, said Douglas. Fine, said Molly, and Molly puffed crossly away. Douglas puffed away too, and ignored Molly's anger. When Molly finished her work, she came home in a bad mood. She was not in the mood to talk to anyone but herself right now. Molly began making herself so worse that she saw Norman, Dennis, and Paxton again. Molly was so cross that she found Norman. Get away from those two, she said, and pumped Norman hard. Whoa, said Norman. He couldn't stop. His brakes were already jammed, and Norman crashed into the ditch. Norman was stuck. Dennis and Paxton were shocked. Molly, said Dennis, what is your problem? Don't do this. Molly did not want to talk. She ignored Dennis and Paxton and began to have rage against Norman. The Fat Controller stumbled in to see what was going on. What's going on here? He said. Has something made Molly angry or what? Norman finally interrupted. No, sir, he said. There was a rampage. It was my good fortune to have Molly with me. Some unseen diesels pushed me off the rails and escaped over the turntable. Is that what happened? He said the Fat Controller to Molly. If that's what he says, said Molly. The Fat Controller soon turned to Dennis. Get him out the ditch immediately. Yes, sir, said Dennis, and at last Dennis pulls Norman out of the ditch. Dennis, said Norman. Stay away from me, Molly, said Dennis, and was very annoyed with Molly. Poor Molly looked very worse. The evening began, and Molly was all alone in the sheds without Paxton and Dennis accompanying her. Soon Dennis finally arrived. "How is he?" said Molly. "Nothing that won't cheer him up," said Dennis. "What's done is done, Molly." "What's done is done, Molly," said "What's done is done, Molly," said Dennis. "He is my brother after all, and he is my brother after all. After all, we told you why he's doing this, but still you refuse to accept it," said Dennis. "And you know what, Molly," said Dennis, "I don't feel safe with you. I'm not happy with you anymore." Molly looked even more worse. "Dennis, please," said Molly. I can apologize to him." Dennis didn't listen. "It's best if we don't see each other anymore," he said. "At least not for a while." "I'm sorry, Molly," said Dennis. Dennis puffed sadly away. Molly knew what Dennis said to her, and was finally realizing that Dennis was not her friend anymore, at least not for a while. Molly soon stayed in the sheds all evening on her own to think about what she really did.